So it was 50 minutes of absolutely riveting live television diplomacy happening in the Oval Office. Joining us now to try and make sense of what exactly happened in those 50 minutes at the White House last Friday, and more importantly, what's next? What's the fallout? What are the consequences of that meeting between President Trump and President Zelensky? I'm now joined by Professor John Mearsheimer from the University of Chicago at the Department of Political Science. Thank you very much, Professor, for speaking with us here on CNN News 18. What a piece of live television. I think Trump ended by saying that this would be great TV. When you first saw what was going on, what was your first reaction?
Well, I was shocked because I had just never seen anything like that. And it was amazing to see President Trump and Vice President Vance really fighting it out with President Zelensky on live television. You just don't see things like that. You know what happens behind closed doors, but it was quite shocking to see it out in the open.
So tell me, for about the first 40 minutes or so, it seemed to be going okay. Both men were making their respective points. At what point did you think it sort of spiraled out of hand and you said, uh-oh, this is not going where both parties wanted to go to?
Well, it's obvious that Vance asked a provocative question of Zelensky, and things then exploded. I think what's going on here is that you have to understand that the British, the French, and the Ukrainians are working together to try to trap the Americans into giving a security guarantee to Ukraine. Trump does not, under any circumstances, want to give Ukraine a security guarantee. And here we're talking about in terms of his negotiations with Putin. The British, the French, and the Ukrainians are trying to get that security guarantee. And you want to remember that on Monday of last week, Macron visited. On Thursday of last week, Starmer visited. And then on Friday, Zelensky came in. And all of the discussion these days is revolving around this mineral deal. And the mineral deal is designed to trap the United States into giving a security commitment in a very sort of indirect way to the Ukrainians. Article 4 of the agreement says there will be common protection of critical resources. This is the way they're trying to trap Trump and company. And Trump won't be trapped. And the truth is, Trump and Vance are sick and tired of playing these games with the Ukrainians, with the British, and with the French, and they won't give them what they want. And what happened is that all of the frustration on the Ukrainian side and on the American side just came about in those last 10 minutes. And that's really what's going on here.
So it's interesting you said it seemed to be going okay till Vance intervened and asked a couple of uncomfortable questions, and then, of course, it just spiraled from there. Now, this is a slightly more difficult one, but what's your best analysis when you saw that video far removed from the actual, from the Oval Office where all this drama was playing out? Do you think it was clear that Vance was sort of the attack dog here? He was going after Zelensky, and Zelensky, fell in for that. Do you think this whole thing was a set piece, that this was an ambush that was planned, or it just spiraled out of control and no one quite could figure out how to, save it?
I don't think it was an ambush, but I do think that Trump and Vance were committed beforehand to making it clear to Zelensky that there was not going to be a security guarantee and there were going to be negotiations with the Russians, even if the Ukrainians, the British, and the French didn't like that. And if you think about the position that Zelensky is in, he's in desperate straits. He's led his country into a war that has resulted in a catastrophe. And he's trying to figure a way out. And he thinks that security guarantee from the United States is absolutely essential, and he can't get it. So the level of frustration here is just enormous. And on the American side, I think that Trump and Vance are sick and tired of being castigated by the British, the French, and the foreign policy establishment in the United States and the Ukrainians for talking to the Russians. So you had a recipe here for disaster. And it took a while to happen. It was only the last 10 minutes. The first 30 or so minutes were rather mild, certainly compared to what came after that. But it's not all that surprising if you think about it as to what happened on Friday.
Is the situation now retrievable? Both Starmer and Macron speaking over the weekend at the big conference that happened in London. Certainly Starmer seems very confident that he can get Trump back around. He in fact even said that both Macron and himself will be visiting the White House soon, and it is his hope that this thing will ultimately have an American backstop. Do you think it's retrievable?
No. I think it's not retrievable. I think Trump has made it clear that he's going to cut a deal with the Russians. And I think he's made it clear that he's not going to give a security guarantee to Ukraine. And that's not going to change regardless of what happened on Friday. And furthermore, if you look at the plan, the so-called peace plan that the British and the French came up with and they unveiled yesterday, it's not a serious proposal. You sort of wonder what planet these people are living on. It has a two-step set of propositions built into it. The first is that you're going to have a ceasefire for about a month. And then the British and the French and their coalition of the willing are going to put peacekeepers inside of Ukraine. The Russians have made it unequivocally clear there's going to be no ceasefire, number one. And number two, they've made it unequivocally clear they're not going to let British and French troops into Ukraine. They may come in, but the Russians will target them. So where did Starmer and Macron get off thinking that this peace plan stands any chance of working? And in addition, as I've said a number of times now, there's going to be no guaranteed by the Americans, because Trump and Vance understand that this plan that Macron and Starmer have come up with is unworkable.
So what if the trade-off for the Americans is that you get whatever $500 billion worth of rare earth minerals from Ukraine?
Well, that was the deal, right? But the question you have to ask yourself is, what's the quid pro quo? What does Ukraine get? Ukraine thought if the United States got $500 billion, that it would be willing to provide protection for those critical resources, those mineral resources. And that would be, in a way, an indirect security guarantee. But the Americans have made it clear there's going to be no security guarantee. So the end result of this mineral deal is a one-sided agreement where the Americans get $500 billion and the Ukrainians get nothing. I can't understand why Zelensky would sign it. It would be remarkably foolish to sign it.
So the other thing with the Europeans is that there's a lot of, solidarity. Zelensky got almost like a hero's welcome in London. There were 18 European leaders. They've all sort of made verbal commitments that they're going to step up their defense spending, so on and so forth. Is it realistically possible, though, that now that, the Trump administration has said that they have no interest in continuing to fund this war, that that Europe can actually fill that void, that Europe can actually step up its defense spending so that Ukraine can continue fighting?
I want to be clear here. I don't think there is all that much unity right now. I think the Italians have made it clear to the French that they cannot commit Italian forces to deploy in Ukraine. And the Italians and the Germans have shown hardly any enthusiasm for the British and French plan. This is really very much a British and French peace plan. So I don't think there's a lot of European unity. And as relations with the Americans continue to spiral out of control, I think you'll see the centrifugal forces that are sitting there below the surface in Europe begin to manifest themselves. And I think there's going to be big trouble ahead. I think the idea that a united Europe is going to come to the rescue of the Ukrainians now that the Americans are divorcing themselves from the Ukrainian situation is not going to happen.
So what's your best guess of how this is likely to play out over the next, let's say, 3 or 4 weeks? So Putin and Trump go in, they make a deal, and then Trump says, okay, that's it, we're not funding Ukraine anymore. What happens after that?
Well, this is just my guess because it's very hard to tell what's going on behind closed doors. And I think that's what really matters, especially with regard to the Russians and the Americans. My sense is the Americans have effectively committed themselves to trying to cut a deal with the Russians. They know what the Russians' terms are for cutting a deal. They're very clear. Putin laid them out on June 14th of 2024. And one would think the Americans clearly understand what they are and have reached the conclusion that they have to accept Russian terms by and large. So I think that the Russians and the Americans will be able to reach an agreement. Then the question is, what happens with the Europeans and the Ukrainians? It's easy to imagine that the Europeans will ultimately go along because they can't do much to really help Ukraine. Whether the Americans can get the Ukrainians on board is another matter. So I think the Americans face a really difficult time, even if they can consummate a deal with Russia, getting the Ukrainians for sure, and maybe even the Europeans on board. So it's going to be tricky to get a meaningful peace settlement here.
So the fighting continues? I mean, Ukraine continues to fight on till the last Ukrainian standing?
That's the way they're talking. My sense is, look, if the Americans pull out their support for Ukraine, Ukraine is going to lose even more rapidly on the battlefield than it's now losing. And one would think at some point there'll be a ceasefire. There will not be a genuine peace agreement. It's very important to distinguish between a ceasefire / frozen conflict, sort of what you had at the end of the Korean War, versus a genuine peace agreement. What the Russians want, and I believe what Trump wants, is a genuine peace agreement where they not only shut down the Ukraine war, they get some meaningful security architecture in place in Europe so we don't have any more trouble in the foreseeable future. That's what Putin and Trump want. But I don't think you're going to get that. I think the war will end. But again, I think you'll get a ceasefire, not a genuine peace agreement. Let's face it, I hope I'm wrong. But when you look at all the factors at play here, it is hard to imagine getting a genuine peace agreement.
What happens to NATO? Do you think there's a fundamental rupture in the transatlantic alliance? Or do you think that this episode can be put in the back burner and America and its European partners can continue to collaborate, provided, as Trump and Vance have been saying, that they raise their defense spending, which I think a lot of countries in Europe are now saying that they will?
I think there has already been a major rupture. I don't think there's much question about that. I think putting Humpty Dumpty back together again is not going to be easy. And in fact, I would argue it's impossible. I think the interesting question is whether the United States pulls so many troops out of Europe that its commitment to NATO, its commitment to Europe just disappears. For all intents and purposes, I think that is possible. I think Trump is radical enough in his approach to Europe, and he has enough contempt for the Europeans that if things don't go his way and the Europeans resist him, he could just, in large part, walk away from Europe. And although NATO might remain formally intact, it'll be a hollow shell of its former self.
So if I think there's about 100,000 U.S. troops in various countries across Europe, if it really came down to that, if push came to shove and as you said, Trump pulls out a large part of those troops out of Europe, Macron, for example, has been talking about raising a European army. Do you think that's just a lot of talk, and would it be possible for the Europeans to raise a collective continental army that protects Europe's interests?
No, I don't think so. I think that the Europeans worked very well together with the United States in the context of NATO because the United States was the big dog. It was the most powerful state in Europe. Obviously, it's not a European country, but it was physically located in Europe with all those troops. And we basically ran the alliance. And we solved, in large part, not completely, but in large part, all the collective action problems that exist among the Europeans. You take the Americans away and the Europeans are left on their own, they're going to be huge collective action problems. And they're not going to be able to put together a United States of Europe or a unified army. As I said, if you look at the present peace plan that the Europeans are floating, it's basically a French-British plan. And there's no evidence that the Italians and the Germans are enthusiastic about it. And I think, again, those centrifugal forces just grow with the passage of time. So I don't see a European army that's going to be able to back up Ukraine. And furthermore, it's not just military wherewithal that you need here. You also need economic support. Huge amounts of money needs to be sent to Ukraine to keep this war going. And if you take the Americans away and the Europeans are on their own, they're effectively going to have to double the amount of money they give to Ukraine for a losing war. How long is that politically sustainable?
My last couple of questions as we come to the concluding part of this interview. What's the reaction like in the Kremlin? People were saying they're opening the champagne bottles or the vodka in the Kremlin. How do you think Putin will now likely treat the next few weeks? Do you think he will rush to have that meeting with Trump sooner than later?
I'm not sure that he'll rush. I think Trump has an interest in rushing to get a deal as quickly as possible so that the Russians don't conquer more territory. I'm not sure the Russians won't think that it makes sense to delay this a bit and capture more territory on the ground. But I think that Putin has to be ecstatic about the fact that the Americans are clearly committed to improving relations with Russia. Even if Putin is still somewhat pessimistic, if not very pessimistic, about getting a genuine peace agreement over Ukraine, he has to be thrilled with the fact that Trump has made it clear that he wants to fundamentally alter relations with Russia and actually have good relations with Russia. This is only good news for the Kremlin.
And finally, what happens to Zelensky? I mean, Trump has been saying that Zelensky is a dictator, there are no elections, he's unpopular, so on and so forth. Do you see, let's say by the summer, Zelensky sort of calling for elections or relinquishing from his post, or he just continues?
Zelensky has no real future. He took Ukraine to war. He went along with the Biden administration and with the European elites. And what he produced for his country is a catastrophe. This war is a catastrophe. And any leader who produces a catastrophic result like this is not long for office. So the only interesting question is when he goes. I mean, his legacy has been firmly established now. He failed to take care of his country. He failed to provide for its survival. He failed to provide for its security. That's his job. That's his number one job. And he was a failure. And history will judge him accordingly.
All right, Professor John Mearsheimer, as always, a pleasure speaking with you, sir. Thank you very much for joining us here on
My
CNBC.
pleasure.